Welcome to my podcast, Love and Courageous. I'm the host, Demetris. And for today's episode, I'll be finishing up with a part 2 of When Was America Great? On this episode, I'll be speaking about the sexual violence that women have endured in America, but also I'll be speaking about the LGBTQ community rights history in America. A lot of people say that America is great, but do people really know the true history of America and how it was built? America was not only built off of slavery, but also sexual violence. Sexual violence is rooted in the foundation of America. It goes back to when Christopher Columbus colonized what is now known as America back in 1492. Sexual violence was a key locus of control that Christopher Columbus used to gain power over the indigenous women. Not only did Christopher Columbus and his people perpetrate acts of sexual violence upon indigenous women and other people of different racial groups, but they also sex trafficked them. Many of the survivors of this violence were between the ages of 9 and 10 years old. Black women are also victims of sexual violence. When slavery was in place, there was a law back in 1662, stating that any children resulting from intercourse between an enslaved woman and a white man were not legally free. This law created economic incentive for white slave owners to rape black women, effectively legalizing sexual violence against black women in America. The law also stated that it was not necessary for black women to give consent in a sexual encounter. Black women were not able to file rape against white men until 1861. Even with this legal protection, black women still were having issues with gaining justice and also being heard. Even during the American Civil War, black women who were enslaved were raped by Union soldiers as a way to show power against the Confederacy. White women were also sexually abused during the Civil War, but their cases were more likely to go to court. Once the case went to court, female survivors experienced even more barriers, such as testifying to all male juries. Survivors were also required to document their age to proceed with a claim. Now, for enslaved black women who often did not know their birthdays, this regulation was one of the many that prevented black women from accessing the criminal justice system and instances of abuse. Before the law of 1861 was passed, in June of 1855, a black woman slave whose name was Celia killed her slave owner, whose name was Robert Newson, in self-defense of an attempted rape after years of abuse. The abuse began when she was just 14 years old. Celia was incarcerated for the time of the trial and delivered a stillborn baby while she was in prison. Now, despite her lawyer arguing at trial that state self-defense laws made no distinction based on race, trial judge William Hall advised the all-white jury that they could not take self-defense argument into account. Celia was found guilty and later executed in December of the same year. Now, when it comes to sexual abuse against black men, sexual violence and scapegoating is also an important foundation of rape against black men in America. Slaves were often not fully clothed and were depicted in images. The portrayal and the systematic objectification of enslaved people contributed to a society that fixated on black bodies and enabled sexual violence against them. For black men, sexual violence included forced coupling and sexual assault of female slaves for the purpose of creating more slaves. Also, sexual assault as punishment, and they were also being sexually abused by white women on the plantations. During the Reconstruction that began in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, white people were watching as the oppressive social order they built was crumbling after the emancipation. They began to seek ways to reassert their power over black people. This resulted in a widespread of sexual violence and violence in general. by white mobs and individuals against black people between the years of 1865 and 1877. And a very big part of this rash of violence relied on framing black men as commonly desiring to rape white women. This resulted in a shift from black men being seen as weak and easily subjugated through slavery to hypermasculine and sexually threatening during the Reconstruction. Due to the lie that was placed on black men by white people, a lot of mass lynchings of black men have occurred. The black men that were lynched were accused of sexually assaulting white women, and there was little to no evidence that was presented to support these claims. Also, a lot of the white women that lied on the black men changed their stories after the black men were murdered. Racialized sexual violence perpetrated by U.S. citizens was not restricted to American soil. During the World War II, systematic sexual violence was perpetrated against women by many different armies. The Japanese military employed a system of sexual slavery that exploited over 200,000 women and girls as comfort women for Japanese soldiers. Over time, historians start to find out that American military was committing wicked acts in Japan during military occupation. There are so many documented instances of American soldiers taking Japanese girls from their homes at gunpoint in military vehicles. Many soldiers used their positions of authority to perform inspections of Japanese homes, only to return later that same night to rape a woman they found in the home. The American occupying forces mandated censorship of many of these incidents in Japanese news outlets, making these cases difficult to prosecute at the time. Now, back in America, black women were also continuing to experience racialized sexual violence during this time. One case that a lot of people might know, Reese Taylor, a 24-year-old black woman. On her walk home from church on September the 3rd of 1944, 7 white guys held her and a friend at gunpoint and abducted Reese Taylor. They took her to a remote area of the woods where 6 of the white guys raped her and left her on the side of the highway. The racial violence of the Jim Crow era prevented a lot of black women from sharing stories. Reese Taylor was one of the few that identified her rapists to the police and testified against them. One of the 7 men confessed afterwards and identified the other 6 guys, who claimed that because they had paid Reese Taylor, the incident could not be considered rape. None of them were taken into custody, and the Taylor family home was burned down the day after the confession. In response to this injustice, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as NAACP, sent Rosa Parks, who was an activist, to investigate and support the Taylor family. Now, Rosa Parks has been known for her role in the Montgomery bus boycott, but she is also the NAACP chief rape investigator and had a large role in the rape crisis movement. Another example of the omittance of black women's role in organizing around sexual violence. Reese Taylor and Rosa Parks' effort to urge support resulted in a hearing on October the 3rd of 1944. The all-white, all-men jury dismissed the case after 5 minutes of deliberation, but Rosa Parks continued to organize alongside other activists by forming the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor. A second trial began on February 14, 1945, resulting in 3 more of the men confessing to the rape. However, none of them were prosecuted for the crime. Racialized narratives of sexual violence continue to direct violence towards black men and young boys in the Jim Crow era. One prime example is Emmett Till, who everyone should know. Emmett Till was visiting family in Mississippi when he entered a convenience store, bought some candy, and interacted with Carolyn Bryant, a white woman, on his way out. Bryant alleged that Emmett Till, who was 14 years old, made sexual advances and wolf whistle at her. A few days later, Roy Bryant, the white woman's husband, and J.W. Milam and her brother-in-law kidnapped Emmett Till from his relative's home, beat him in Milam's tool house, shot him, and threw his body Tallahatchie River. A cotton gin fan was attached to his neck with barbed wire to weigh him down. When his body was recovered 3 days later, it was so dismembered that his relatives could only identify him by a ring left on his finger. Till's mother insisted to have an open casket at the funeral, so that the world was forced to confront the heart-wrenching and harsh effects of racism in the Jim Crow South. 50,000 people attended the funeral, and Jet magazine published photos of Emmett Till's body that attracted national attention. Bryant and Milam were acquitted by another all-male, all-white jury. They went on to sell a detailed account of the murder to Look magazine, which published the article in 1956. Carolyn Bryant also changed her testimony, stating that Emmett Till did not make any sort of advance towards her. The horror of this case is often cited as a key factor in the advent of the civil rights movement. 3 months after the discovery of Emmett Till's body, the Montgomery bus boycott began. Now, in the 1970s, people started to see a streamlined professionalization in the rape crisis movement. Now, this era produced many victories for the cause. It was also driven by the whitewashing of a movement that began with the work of BIPOC and queer people. Much of what we recognize as the rape crisis movement today started with the testimonies of Frances Thompson and Lucy Smith following the Memphis riots of 1866. These black women were raped by a white mob fueled by the racist tensions underlying Reconstruction and post-emancipation America. In coverage of their testimonies, news outlets attempted to discredit Thompson specifically because she was assigned male at birth, but presented herself in a very traditionally woman way. Articles about the testimony included the results of examinations by doctors of Thompson's genitalia and discussing the beginnings of more mainstream activism in the 70s. It is crucial to remember these women and so many others who were breaking the silence around sexual violence even before infrastructural support for such resistance existed. One of the most notable accomplishments for the movement of the 1970s was the opening of the first rape crisis center in San Francisco. The center is named Bay Area Women Against Rape, also known as BAWAR, and was co-founded by Oleta Abrams in 1971. Her daughter, who was 15 years old, experienced sexual violence in a stairwell at Berkeley High School and was not adequately supported by police officers and doctors after reporting. This lit a fire in Abrams to create a source that would have benefited her daughter and her experience as a survivor. A year later, in 1972, Title IX was enacted into law. The piece of legislation sponsored by Senator Birch Bayh is associated most strongly with its application to sports, but it has a tremendous role in providing protections to survivors of sexual violence as well. Case law concerning Title IX has evolved to create a legal duty for schools receiving federal funding to protect students from gender-based violence, making it an important piece of the puzzle in addressing sexual violence on college campus. Now, when it comes to systemic violence against the indigenous women still remains to this day. In November of 1982, American Multiple Industries published the video game called Custer's Revenge. Players took on the persona of a United States commander that earned points for each successful rape of a physically restrained indigenous woman. While Custer's revenge sparked mass protests that succeeded in removing it from circulation, it did not leave the shelves before selling approximately 80,000 copies of the game. A remake of the game was published online in 2014. In the same year, America funded sexual violence and violence in general against indigenous people in Guatemala, or commonly known as Maya genocide. The Guatemalan government systematically raped, tortured, and murdered Maya people during the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996. 900,000 Maya people were displaced and 166,000 were killed. During the Rio Negro massacres, the specific event known and funded by America in 1982, Guatemalan soldiers forced Maya women to dance for their entertainment before taking them apart from the group to rape. They then forced the captured Maya group to walk up a nearby mountain while beating the women and the children. Once they reached the top, the group was brutally massacred. That's all for the sexual violence. Now I'm going to get into the history of gay rights in America. So, back in 1924, December the 10th, the Society for Human Rights was founded by Henry Gerber in Chicago. The Society is the first gay rights organization as well as the oldest documented in America. After receiving a charter from the state of Illinois, the Society publishes the first American publication for homosexuals, Friendship and Freedom. Soon after its founding, the Society disbands due to political pressure. In 1948, biologist and sex researcher Alfred Kinsey publishes Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. From his research, Alfred Kinsey concludes that homosexual behavior is not restricted to people who identify themselves as homosexual, and that 37% of men have enjoyed homosexual activities at least once, while psychologists and psychiatrists consider homosexuality a form of illness. The findings surprised many conservative notions about sexuality. 2 years later, on November the 11th, in 1950, in Los Angeles, gay rights activist Harry Hay found America's first sustained national gay rights organization. In an attempt to change public perception of homosexuality, the Mattachine Society aims to eliminate discrimination, prejudice, and bigotry, to assimilate homosexuals into mainstream society, and to cultivate the notion of an ethical homosexual culture. On December the 15th of the same year, a Senate report titled Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government is distributed to members of Congress after the federal government had covertly investigated employees' sexual orientation at the beginning of the Cold War. The report states since homosexuality is a mental illness, homosexuals constitute security risk to the nation because those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons. Over the previous years, more than 4,380 gay men and women had been discharged from the military and around 500 fired from their jobs with the government. The purging will become known as the Lavender Scare. In April 1952, the American Psychiatric Association lists homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance in its first publication of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Immediately following the manual's release, many professionals in medicine and mental health and social sciences criticized the categorization due to lack of empirical and scientific data. In 1953, on April the 27th, President Dwight Eisenhower signs Executive Order 10450, banning homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. The order lists homosexuals as a security risk along with alcoholics and neurotics. In 1955, on September 21st in San Francisco, the Daughters of Bilitis becomes the first lesbian rights organization in America. The organization hosts social functions providing alternatives to lesbian bars and clubs, which are frequently raided by police officers. In 1956, on August the 30th, American psychologist Evelyn Hooker shares her paper, The Adjustment of the Male Overt Homosexual, at the American Psychological Association Convention in Chicago. After administering psychological tests such as the Rorschach to groups of homosexual and heterosexual males, Hooker's research concludes homosexuality is not a clinical entity and that heterosexual and homosexuals do not differ significantly. Hooker's experiment becomes very influential, changing clinical perceptions of homosexuality. In 1958, on January the 13th, in the landmark case 1 Inc. versus Olison, the United States Supreme Court rules in favor of the First Amendment rights of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, also known as LGBT, Magazine 1, the homosexual magazine. The suit was filed after the U.S. Postal Service and FBI declared the magazine obscene material, and it marks the first time the United States Supreme Court rules in favor of homosexuals. In 1962, on January the 1st, Illinois repeals its sodomy laws, becoming the first U.S. state to decriminalize homosexuality. 3 years later, in 1965, July the 4th, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, picketers began staging the first Reminder Day to call public attention to the lack of civil rights for LGBT people. The gathering will continue annually for 5 years. The next following year, on April the 21st, members of the Managing Society staged a sit-in at the Julius Bar in Greenwich Village, where the New York Liquor Authority prohibits serving gay patrons in bars on the basis that homosexuals are disorderly. Society President Dick Leitch and other members announced their homosexuality and are immediately refused service. Following the sit-in, the Managing Society will sue the New York Liquor Authority, although no laws are overturned. The New York City Commission on Human Rights declared that homosexuals have the right to be served. In 1966, on August, after transgender customers become raucous in a 24-hour San Francisco cafeteria, management calls the police. When a police officer manhandles one of the patrons, she throws coffee in his face and a riot develops, eventually spilling out onto the street, destroying police and public property. Following the riot, activists established the National Transsexual Counseling Unit, the first peer-run support and advocacy organization in the world. 3 years later, on June the 28th, patrons of the Stonewall Inn and Greenwich Village riot when police officers attempt to raid the popular gay bar around 1 in the morning. Since its establishment in 1967, the bar had been frequently raided by police officers trying to clean up the neighborhood of sexual deviance. Angry gay youth clashed with aggressive police officers in the streets, leading to a 3-day riot during which thousands of protesters received only minimum local news coverage. Nonetheless, the event will be credited with reigniting the fire behind America's modern LGBT rights movement. The next following year, in June the 28th, Christopher State Liberation Day commemorates the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots. Following the event, thousands of members of the LGBT community marched through New York into Central Park in what will be considered America's first gay pride parade. In the coming decades, the annual Gay Pride Parade will spread to dozens of countries around the world. On December the 15th, in 1973, the board of the American Psychiatric Association votes to remove homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. The next following year, in January, Kathy Kazajenko, becomes the first openly gay American elected to public office when she wins a seat on the Ann Arbor, Michigan City Council. On June the 7th of 1977, singer and conservative Southern Baptist Anita Bryant leads a successful campaign with the Save Our Children crusade to repeal a gay rights ordinance in Dade County, Florida. Bryant faces severe backlash from gay rights supporters in America. The gay rights ordinance will not be reinstated in Dade County until December the 1st of 1998. The same year, on November the 8th, Harvey Milk wins a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and is responsible for introducing a gay rights ordinance protecting gays and lesbians from being fired from their jobs. Harvey Milk also leads a successful campaign against Proposition 6, an initiative forbidding homosexual teachers. A year later, on November 27th of 1978, former city supervisor Dan White assassinates Harvey Milk. Dan White actions are motivated by jealousy and depression rather than homophobia. May the 21st, 1979, Dan White is convicted of voluntary manslaughter and is sentenced to 7 years in prison. On October the 14th, 1979, an estimated 75,000 people participate in the National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. LGBT people and straight allies demand equal civil rights and urge for the passage of protective civil rights legislation. The next following year, on July the 8th, the Democratic Rules Committee states that it will not discriminate against homosexuals. After a national convention on August the 11th through the 14th, the Democrats become the first major political party to endorse a homosexual rights platform. In 1981, on July 3rd, the New York Times prints the first story of a rare pneumonia and skin cancer found in 41 gay men in New York and California. The CDC initially refers to the disease as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency disorder. But when the symptoms were found outside the gay community, Bruce Boiler, biologist and founder of the National Gay Task Force, successfully lobbies to change the name of the disease to AIDS. In 1982, on March the 2nd, Wisconsin becomes the first state to outlaw discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In 1987, on October the 11th, hundreds of thousands of activists take part in the National March on Washington to demand that President Ronald Reagan address the AIDS crisis. Even though AIDS had been reported in 1981, Ronald Reagan did not speak about the epidemic until the end of his presidency. Now, in the year 1988, between the month of May and June, the CDC mails a brochure, Understanding AIDS, to every household in America. Approximately 107 million brochures were mailed. In the same year, on December the 1st, the World Health Organization organized the first World AIDS Day to raise awareness of the spreading pandemic. In 1990, on August the 18th, President George Bush signs the Ryan White Care Act, a federally funded program for people living with AIDS. Ryan White, an Indiana teenager, contracted AIDS in 1984 through a tainted hemophilia treatment. After being barred from attending school because of his HIV positive status, Ryan White becomes a well-known activist for AIDS research and anti-discrimination. In 1991, created by New York-based Visual AIDS, the red ribbon is adopted as a symbol of awareness and compassion for those living with HIV and AIDS. On December 21st, in 1993, the Department of Defense issues a directive prohibiting the U.S. military from barring applicants from service based on their sexual orientation. Applicants shall not be asked or required to reveal whether they are homosexual, states the new policy, which still forbids applicants from engaging in homosexual acts or making a statement that he or she is homosexual. This policy is known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. On May the 20th, 1996, in the case of Romer versus Evans, the United States Supreme Court decides that Colorado's Second Amendment denying gays and lesbians protections against discrimination is unconstitutional, calling them special rights. On September the 21st, in 1996, President Clinton signs the Defense of Marriage Act into law. The law defines marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman, and that no state is required to recognize a same-sex marriage from out of state. In 2000, on April the 21st, Vermont becomes the first state in America to legalize civil unions and register partnership between same-sex couples. 3 years later, on June 26th, in Lawrence versus Texas, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that sodomy laws in the U.S. are unconstitutional. A year later, on May the 18th, Massachusetts becomes the first state to legalize gay marriage. The court finds the prohibition of gay marriage unconstitutional because it denies dignity and equality of all individuals. In the following 6 years, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., and Iowa will follow. In 2008, on November the 4th, California voters approved Proposition 8, making same-sex marriage in California illegal. The passing of the ballot garners national attention from gay rights supporters in America. Proposition 8 inspires the NOH8 campaign, a photo project that used celebrities to promote marriage equality. The following year, in 2009, on June the 17th, President Barack Obama signs a presidential memorandum allowing same-sex partners of federal employees to receive certain benefits. The memorandum does not cover full health coverage. In 2009, on October the 28th, the Matthew Shepard Act is passed by Congress and signed into law by President Barack Obama. The measure expands the 1969 U.S. federal hate crime law to include crimes motivated by victims' actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. Matthew Shepard was tortured and murdered near Laramie, Wyoming on October the 7th, 1998 because of his sexual orientation. On August the 4th of 2010, a federal judge in San Francisco decides that gays and lesbians have the constitutional right to marry and that Prop 8 is unconstitutional, and lawyers will challenge the finding. The same year, on December the 18th, the U.S. Senate votes 65 to a 31 vote to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the U.S. military. On February 23rd of 2011, Barack Obama states his administration will no longer defend the Defense of Marriage Act, which bans the recognition of same-sex marriage. The same year, on June the 24th, New York State passes the Marriage Equity Act, becoming the largest state thus far to legalize gay marriage. 4 years later, on June the 26th, with a 5-4 vote decision in Obergefell versus Hodges, the U.S. Supreme Court declared same-sex marriage legal in all states. That is all for the topic for today, and now I'm going to get into the Black History Fact. So the Black History Fact for today will be about the 1908 Springfield riot. A white woman named Mabel Hallam claimed that a black man named George Richardson raped her. George Richardson was taken into custody along with Joe James, another black man who was being held on murder charges. 5,000 white mob members gathered outside the jail and demanded the release of the two men so that they could inflict their own violence upon them. The two men were secretly moved to another jail, and the white mob, upon learning this, erupted. They went to black neighborhoods and destroyed black businesses and homes until the violence eventually led up to the lynching of Scott Burton and Will Donegan, two prominent leaders in the black community. Mabel Hallam changed her rape allegation 2 weeks after the riot. That is all for today. For my next episode, I'll be speaking about Donald Trump saying that he wants to expand the country to Canada, Greenland, and Panama Canal. So thank you everyone for listening to my podcast, and I hope you all have a lovely day.